Well, a fantastic Phantom Thursday to you. We are at the Taktische Luftwaffengeschwader 74 Airbase at Neuburg an der Donau, taking a look at the F-4F Phantom, which this Geschwader was flying for a very long time indeed. So as always, we're going to start up on the nose. And what do we have? Well, we have, of course, the pitot tube all the way in front. Let's put the sleeve back on there. And then let's talk about the radar set in the nose. We have, in this Phantom right here, F-4F is a simplified version initially of the F-4E. However, with additional upgrades that were installed, the capabilities were vastly enhanced, and one of those was, of course, the APQ-65 radar set. Initially, when the Bundeswehr, or the Luftwaffe, got the Phantom, it was mainly using Sidewinders, so IR homing missiles, in order to shoot at enemy air targets. But with the APQ-65 on the ICE upgrade and the improved combat efficiency enhancement that came out, they were also able to fire AMRAAMs. Specifically, this radar set, of course, expand. It has a range of around about 150 kilometers on your search. It also has track while search and can be used for air-to-air and air-to-ground. But specifically here on the Phantom, what it brought with it was the ability to fire those AMRAAMs at very long ranges indeed. Moving further backwards from the nose, typically in the Phantom, what you would also find a couple of antennas for ADF and UHF around about here. And then, of course, we have the front gear. It is a steering wheel on the Phantom that can be used for ground taxiing. However, there's also redundancy in play by the fact that you have differential braking should you need it in order to steer the aircraft on the ground. Now, moving backwards, of course, you can already see the fairing for the cannon, but as always on Inside the Cockpit, we're doing the weaponry on the port side of the aircraft. So let's move further back. You, of course, know that the Phantom is a tandem twin-seater, pilot up front, weapon systems officer in the back, and we're going to jump on board very soon. Here we are at the wing. It's a swept wing that mounts anhedrally towards the wingtip in a separate section. And of course, there's also a wing fold that decreases the overall span of the aircraft when you're storing it in a hangar, which is quite handy. On the wing itself, we also have these automatic leading edge slats, which extend automatically. They're coupled basically to the AOA meters, but they're also used during takeoff hydraulically there in conjunction with the flaps. Below the main wing, we also have the gear with an inwards retraction hydraulically. There's a wing tank that sits in each wing, 4,000 pounds. And as we then come to the wing fold, you can also discover the powerhouse, or one of the powerhouses of the Phantom. This is the General Electric J7917A. And it pumps out around about 12,000 pounds of thrust in military power. Once you're going to afterburner, 18,000 pounds of thrust there. It also powers on each side one hydraulic system, PC1 and PC2, that is used mainly for the flight controls of the aircraft. And there's also a utility hydraulic system, which is powered by a separate pump, and that provides hydraulic power for the gear, the flaps, the speed brakes, anything that you might want to need there. And that utility hydraulic system is also used as a redundancy for the flight controls should one of the PCs break. Electrical generators are also installed, one per each engine, and then you have rectifiers in the aircraft that make that translation from AC to DC power as well, and 2 batteries are installed as well. And as you could expect from an afterburning engine of this generation, it has a variable exhaust nozzle. Now, coming to the control surfaces of the Phantom here with the aileron, we find something really, really cool. We have an aileron, we have a spoiler on top of the wing, and then we have the flaps. Now, the aileron can only deflect 30 degrees downwards. Now, that appears normal, but once you deflect it into positive degrees, you only have 1 degree. The spoiler instead does the positive deflection on the wing, up to 45 degrees, which means that if a Phantom were to roll, let's say, to the right, this aileron would barely move upwards. It's actually the spoiler that does the control input, which also means that if you ever watch a documentary about a Phantom and there's some snazzy computer animated scene going on, and you see these ailerons deflecting upwards, you know the makers have not done their research. Behind that is, of course, the flap. The flap itself is hydraulically powered. The Phantom here that we have, the F-4F, does not have the boundary layer control neither on the front nor at the back, but the flap itself is working in conjunction with those slats in order to provide more lift on takeoff, and they're hydraulically powered. Then coming to the main fuselage, on top of the spine, we have the refueling receptacle for air-to-air refueling, and then we have additional fuel tanks installed as well. Now, depending on how you want to look at it, there are either 1 or 7 fuel tanks in the fuselage. It's basically one elongated fuel tank made out of 7 compartments, all the way up the front with tank number 1 going further backwards to tank number 7, and they're mounted almost in a sort of a slope so that with gravity itself it can feed the fuel from tank number 7 all the way down to tank number 1. But of course there are also fuel tanks and negative G provisions there in order to move that fuel safely, never mind the maneuver that is being pulled by the pilot. The total capacity there is 8,000 pounds, which together with the 4,000 pounds in each wing brings you up to 16,000 pounds of internal fuel, which is pretty good. Moving then towards the back of the aircraft, the tail, we have the arrestor hook, and then we come to this anhedrali angled, all moving one-piece stabilizer. It is angled at 23 degrees, and it was angled in such a way in order to improve better control at higher AOAs. The tail itself, quite a big tail. You also see an additional pitot tube there, and there would also be communication antennas mounted inside. Also features a rudder, hydraulically operated, with a limited mechanical backup in place as well. And then this compartment here with the door that is opened would house the drag chute as well to minimize the distance on landing that the aircraft requires. Moving around then the tail, we come towards the port side. And now let's talk about the engines, the weapons actually, they're taking a note, of course, of this navigational lighting that is on the wingtip. Now the Phantom has 9 hardpoints and can carry around about 18 to 19,000 pounds of stores, external stores. And the aircraft itself, empty, would weigh 30,000 pounds, and it goes all the way up to a maximum takeoff at 62,000 pounds. But what we have externally is either fuel tanks. There is one provision per wing for fuel tank 2,300 pounds, and the centerline hardpoint can mount an additional drop tank as well, 3,700 pounds there. Beyond that, you can have reconnaissance pods or electronic countermeasure pods. In fact, there's one electronic countermeasure pod installed right there. You can have a close-up of that as well. And then you can set up the Phantom in air-to-air and air-to-ground mission sets. So for air-to-ground, we have very simple sort of dumb bombs with 18 Mark 82s or 5 Mark 84s. You have cluster munitions that you can set up as well. You have guide bombs you can set up. And then, of course, missiles. You can have up to 6 Maverick missiles or AGM-65s, or if you want to do some SEADs, or suppression of enemy air defenses, you can mount some Shrikes or AGM-88 HARM missiles there as well. And of course, in the air-to-air variant, you can go with, say, 4 AIM-9 Sidewinders. This is in some of the Phantoms as well, not necessarily in the Bundeswehr ones, but you could also have the AIM-7 Sparrows, or later on then, of course, the AIM-120 AMRAAMs. And that is, of course, the missile and the droppable ordnance covered. However, this Phantom also has a gun. Now, the Phantoms, when they came out initially, this was in a time and place in history when there was a lot of trust being put into new technology and new missiles, and as such, the aircraft initially did not come out with a gun. That was rectified, that problem, with a gun pod initially. But here we have the M61A1. It's a 20 by 102 millimeter 6-barrel rotary cannon, firing 6,000 rounds a minute. And in the ammo compartment that sits above the cannon, you find 650 rounds, which gives you roughly 10.5 seconds of firing time. And now, having done the aircraft from the outside. By the way, this air intake is for the air conditioning system. We are now going to jump inside. So let's go. Jumping into the Phantom then, let's go through the pilot seat first and then the weapon system officer or WISO. Starting out all the way on the lower left, we find the first controls. We have the countermeasure control unit set next to the auxiliary armament panel. This controls, for example, the volume of that acoustic growl you know from the AIM-9 Sidewinders. On board of that is the intercom for pilot to weapon system officer communication and the autopilot flight control system unit. On the outside, the fuel system control unit. Moving our gaze upwards, we find the slats override switch, which I suspect has a very German spelling mistake of a D instead of a T. It's set next to the gun camera switch and then the flap and slats control with an emergency release. Next up is the throttle quadrant with integrated ignition switches. Each throttle controls the respectively sided engine, and the engine go into full afterburner if the pilot pushes the throttle forward past mill power. On the side of the throttle you will find the speed brake switch and the press to torque button. Next to the throttle we have the engine master and starter switches, and then that square knob on a red rubber cover, that is the air-to-ground missile controller. In front of this is the oxygen system and the capacity indicator. Moving forward to the left-hand side of the central instrument board, we find the gear lever. And then tucked behind that is the stabilizer trim indicator for the pitch axis, the emergency release for our external stores, as well as visual indicators for slat, flap and gear positions, as well as the booster pump indicators. Above this, offset still to the left, a clock, and then the emergency release for the canopy. Alright, now strap in. Here comes the good stuff. Top left on the front instrument board, the accelerometer. Below this, and then moving right, the radar altimeter, the speedometer with an integrated Mach counter, and then a gyroscopic artificial horizon, and a second conventional altimeter. The artificial horizon is flanked by an angle of attack and rate of climb meter. Below that, the heading and directional compass, and a standby artificial horizon rounds up the main flight instruments. Then, for everything that goes daka daka, wish and boom, the master arm switch and the weapons control panel. And then as we move to the right, we find the engine dials as you'd expect. First up, the ground speed meter in knots, and then we come to, well, the engine nozzle position indicators, the 2 RPM and temperature gauges, and then the fuel flow indicators round off this area for the pilot. Tucked to the top right, the control panel for the radar warning receiver, which we will see shortly. As we look up now, we have your radar scope and the radar and HUD controls. The HUD itself is straight ahead, with a visual indicator for weapons employment. An obligatory whiskey compass flanks this, together with, well, that radar warning receiver indicator that I talked about. On the canopy we find a set of mirrors for rearward visibility. This has been optimized to not decrease your FPS. Now we look down, beyond the control stick. The navigational mode control switch is to the top left, and below it we find the AIM-9 specific control panel for the different missile variants and seeker head cooling, and to the right, hydraulic pressure indicators, and then in the middle, the rudder pedal adjustment flywheel, and then all the way in the bottom, no idea how it was actually supposed to be visible to the pilot, we have the ammo rounds counter. Then on the pilot's right side, first up the warning light panel and the electric generator controls, as well as the UHF and radio finding navigational control panel, and this is followed by the TACAN navigation panel and the IFF controls. Moving further back, the emergency floodlights control unit and the temperature control panel with following cockpit and external lighting controls, and all of this is rounded off with the compass control panel. Finally, your controls for the aircraft. Yaw is of course done with the pedals, but here is the stick for your roll and pitch axis. On top, the trim switch. To the side, the pickle switch for ordnance. Out of view here, but behind this, the trigger switch for guns and air-to-air missiles. The air refueling release button is slightly lower. This one also has some weapon selection functions. Behind the stick, the nose wheel steering button, and out of view, a small emergency quick release lever, for example for the anti-skid or autopilot system. Now that's us done for the pilot. So now, welcome to the Weapon System Officer or WISO station. The WISO assists the pilot and focuses on weapon employment. This was required as the systems had gotten a little out of hand and quite complex for one person to just manage everything. After the Phantom, the majority of jet fighters once again featured only one crew member, as technological progress had made it a lot simpler to miniaturize and automate systems that had required complex work procedures before it. But we're in the Phantom, so let's go through the WISO station. Starting on the far left, first up we have the communications control panel. In front of that, towards the WISO, the radar and weapon control panel, and outboard of this, the cabin altitude and oxygen quantity gauge, and this section is finished up with the countermeasure controls. Moving forward, we find an emergency flap release and the throttle. The WISO doubled as an emergency pilot of sorts. The throttles have broadly the same functionality as the pilot, including the switches on it. However, there is no afterburning setting, which could only be reached from the back if the front throttles of the pilot had been pushed to that setting. Also, startup and shutdown can only be done from the front. The intercom control panel is in front of the throttle. Right, moving forward. Tucked slightly away to the lower left in front, very similar looking gauges and controls as up front for oxygen, various position indicators for gear and flaps and slats, weapons, and then of course the emergency release for gear and brakes are also found here. Straight in front we have similar looking gauges but arranged very differently. Around the canopy the mirrors are found. And as we look inside, going left to right, top to bottom, we have the command selective valve to select single or dual ejection for the emergency ejection seats. Right now, vertically, it is set to single. We have then a whiskey compass and the radar warning receiver with its associated control panel. Below this, in a row, the angle of attack and rate of climb meter, then a clock, and the accelerometer next to the turn and slip indicator. In the lower row, an altimeter, a gyro artificial horizon, a speedometer, and a heading indicator. To the right, engine RPM gauges and ground and true airspeed indicators in knots. Shifting our gaze downwards, we have the protective cover, and behind that is the radar screen. Set below this, the control knobs for the radar screen. Note how they are all shaped very differently, to make it obvious to the WISO which knob does what, without having to reference it visually. To the right then, the radar control handle. And then as we continue on the right hand side, we have a display unit and the INS control panel. Behind this is the TACAN control panel and the controls for the weapon display. Outboard, the radar cursor control panel, and tucked all the way in the back, cockpit lighting controls. Alright, final piece in the puzzle, the WISO stick. As said, the WISO is basically a backup pilot. Pedals for yaw control are available and the stick here has the same functionality as in front, though it does not feature here the air refueling switch. And that is the Phantom. Hope you enjoyed this tour of the fantastic Phantom, and if you enjoy this sort of content, do check out Patreon and channel membership support options, as Inside the Cockpit is 100% community funded. Big thank you here also to LWG 74 for hosting us here at their airbase. It is not a publicly accessible museum, however, you do have a chance of getting access as part of a guided tour. However, the access restrictions are in place, so do check out the description for more information on that. As always, I wish all of you a great day and see you in the sky.